Greetings all, and welcome to the fourth segment of our Traveler's Guide 2 for Zebes. And today, we'll be continuing with our examination of the planet with this next segment, a Traveler's Guide to Norfair. Norfair was truly one of the most inhospitable places to be found on Zebes, as it was so close to the planet's core that the intense heat of the area made it impossible for anyone to travel through its deep corridors without something like the Varisuit to protect them against the extreme heat. Many of the monsters that occupied this area of the planet were specifically designed to make the most of it, resulting in creatures that could resist the temperature of the magma trapped in this land, and in general thrive in places where even humans could not dare to tread. It is noted though that Norfair was not all fire and brimstone, as there were patches of colored tunnels where unique ore in the rock walls and foundations acted as a heat sink that could handle the heat and not radiate it further, essentially insulating these tunnels and making it possible for non-thermophiles to survive in the cavernous pits of the area. Norfair, much like Brinstar, was a hub for Choso and space power forces as it was connected to many different areas within the planet, including at least one, Lower Norfair, that was impossible to access without going through the fiery world. Getting through Norfair could be a challenge, but for a bounty hunter like the Hunter, the numerous upgrades and items to be found on the land were simply too much to pass up. It is lastly noted that it was here that she was forced to face the damaged monsters known as Crocomire, and indirectly causes death, as it proved to be an obstacle for progress on her last journey through the planet. Before we take a good look at the unique biota of this area, it's important to note that, as far as previously covered organisms go, this area was home to the Varisuit, Metairie, Ripper, Ripper-2, Silver Gemer, Alcoon, Beatom, Boyon, Kakatak, Gamut, Garuda, Kago, Scree, Desgiga, Tripper, Waver, and Yapping Maw. Now then, let's see what just sort of new fiery menaces could be found in the depths of this overheated cavern system during the Hunter Zero mission. Silvers were a cousin of the Gemer and were only found in extremely hot environments. Like the Zoomer, these creatures fed off through soil and rocks in order to obtain vital nutrients, but they were different in that their bodies were coated with a spiky, fireproof wool that not only kept them safe from fire, but also excreted a flammable liquid that ignited in high temperature areas, setting them alight. These creatures would usually store superheated gas inside their bodies as they approached a target, and once they were within range of the enemy, the Silver would release the gas from its back, which would then be ignited by the flames on their back and sent them flying towards their target. This flaming tackle was not that powerful, but it could still be a problem without fireproof suit material. Silvers were easily harmed by any weapon fire of any type, just like the Zoomer relatives, and they were especially weak to extreme cold and in turn all-freezing weapon systems, giving plenty of opportunities to eliminate them quickly and thus leaving them best classified within threat level Alpha. The dragon filament consisted of a pair of organisms that were specifically designed to live within the lava-drenched corridors of Norfair and were more than capable of being a severe pain as a result. While dragons and alcoons share much of their anatomy with one another, they were still noticeably different creatures as a result of the type of environments they were comfortable living in. Dragons were able to withstand the intense heat of lava and magma, and thus made their homes in the subsurface. To feed, these creatures would raise the long serpentine bodies, which are colored green in Crateria but red in Norfair, and seahorse-like heads up to the surface and waited for a small prey item to come near them. Once in range, the dragon would expose his body out of the magma and spew fireballs at the target in the hopes of scorching it or at least knocking it into the magma if it was fireproof, where the creature could then use its long body to constrict its prey to death. As ambush predators, these creatures perfectly blended in with their surroundings and could be very difficult to kill, as their armored bodies made them resistant against the power of some beam weapons, but they could still be frozen and destroyed by powerful weapons like the wave beam and concussive missile weapons, and really couldn't leave their magma-soaked lair in any real way, making them a perfect fit for threat level Beta. Gamut were small, beetle-like insectoids that made the home of the interior workings and pipe systems of Norfair prior to the destruction of Zebes. The Gamut itself was covered in a thick, durable exoskeleton shell that kept it from easily being damaged by direct attacks, though it could still be damaged easily by standard weapons. It additionally possessed a thin horn on the very top of its head for the purpose of mating display, and had a deformed lower body, with the head taking up the majority of their body space and being the attachment point of their wings, which being just fast enough to lift the otherwise heavy bodies into the air. These creatures fed off of smaller, more insignificant insectoids, as well as the occasional mineral-laced rock for sustenance, crushing their foodstuff with powerful jaws that are deceptively strong for their small size. Up until the destruction with the end of Zebes, these creatures, along with other insectoid beasts of a similar size, had created massive hives beneath the surface of the planet and occupied more space of the planet's interior than almost any other type of organism. Most of the time, these creatures would remain in the ground and not bother other life forms, but when they had the urge to feed or at least had to leave their homes to find food, they did not always dig their own tunnels. Instead, they used the armored head to ram the sides of air holes that led to the surface until they could crack them open and make an opening. Once the hole was made, these creatures could freely fly in and out of the air holes to the surface where there was plentiful food, returning only after getting their fill or were forced to escape a large predator. As far as monsters go, these creatures were very weak and could usually only sustain a shot or two from any type of weapon, but they could still fly quite fast, and their sharp teeth made it a bad idea to get in their way, especially since they were known to be immune to the effects of acid, and thus sometimes made the nest in acid-drenched holes, and the force of their blows has a habit of knocking others into hazards that may be more dangerous than the creatures themselves, and in turn, they occupy a solid niche in threat level alpha. Garudas were a subspecies of the Rio that are far more powerful than their relatives and more than capable of proving to be a serious threat. The wings of the Garuda were actually covered in armor, as was the rest of their body, and the armored skin could ignite to generate fire and radiate the energy inside their bodies to provide the energy they needed to lift otherwise heavier bodies into the air. While this meant that they were capable of sustaining more damage than their relatives, this did not mean that they were any more difficult to harm, as they were still weak to basic weapon fire. Furthermore, they share the same attack pattern possessed by the Rio, swooping up and down in a zigzag fashion in order to attack prey from below, grabbing them with the large pinchers and snipping off massive hunks of flesh with every strike. Even so, their predictable movement patterns meant they could be easy to take out with enough patience, though they could travel in numbers and prove to be a bit overwhelming if one did not have a fast trigger finger to handle them with, locking them securely within threat level beta. The Holts were a race of artificial sentries that were built by the Zebesian space pirates to patrol the lower areas of Norfair, where their leader Ridley staged his comeback and confronted the Hunter on numerous occasions. The creatures possessed a round, almost owl-like body form, with a pair of large spikes on the top of its body, a pair of rocket jets on the opposite side, a single eye, and a pair of mandible-like strings that hung from the lower torso. The creatures used their rocket jets for flight, but they were a bit different than other creatures with a similar propulsion system, as they could alternate the intensity of their rockets in mid-flight, allowing them to actually gain some horizontal ground in flight, and thus sweep back and forth over a much larger area than what they normally would have been able to cover. The central eye acted as a repository of data, and was directly connected to the space pirate datanet. The moment they detected an intruder, they would start to attack and simultaneously send out an alert signal to let other sentries and space pirates know that they were under attack. The large spikes on the top of their head were generally used to anchor themselves in place as they waited for something to pass by them, and they were flexible enough they could dig their way through ceilings of just about any rock type without losing their grip. As far as attacking goes, the small strings that hung from the lower bodies were actually highly conductive rods that they placed onto enemies as they swooped onto them to discharge massive amounts of electricity, electrocuting their target in the process. Thankfully, as simple sentries, the attack patterns of the Holts were easy to learn and dodge, but it is nonetheless noted that they were far sturdier than they looked, and could take damage from weapon systems for a bit longer than most of the denizens in Norfair, making them a potential threat in large numbers and well received within threat level beta. Melons are another subspecies of the Rio, and are distinguished from their close relatives by the ability to ignite a flammable oil on their backs that turns them into a burning torch, not only protecting them against the effects of heat, but also making them completely fireproof. Melons will generally fly in a diagonal pattern to their targets in an attempt to latch onto them to set them alight or roast them to death, from which point the melon can dine on the burnt carcass with their small mandibles. The flight pods they tend to nest in are also commonly on fire and immune to the effects of extreme heat. However, these simple insects in their flight pods are highly weak against the effects of extreme cold, and are thus easily taken down with freezing weaponry like the ice beam. The only thing that really makes melons a threat is their penchant for traveling in large numbers, but they are thankfully slow enough that this is not a serious problem, so they can only rank within threat level alpha at best.
I still find it more than a bit strange that so many of the creatures that dwell in these fiery pits are, to be blunt, on fire, or otherwise use fire as a weapon of some sort when hunting and defending themselves. Norfair and similar locations are all about extreme heat, but that also means that so many of these entities are resistant to the effects of heat as well. So honestly, what exactly is the point? I would need to really examine this further. It could have great implications for future visits to other worlds, virtual or not.
The Viola and Multiviola are bizarre creatures that cannot be considered to be true living creatures, as they're actually little more than the psychic manifestations of Mother Brain's power in the past. In their larval state, these creatures were referred to as Violas, and looked like colored spheres of energy that had an eerie faced plastodon just beneath the surface, though the actual purpose of this face is still unknown. These creatures use electromagnetic energy to stick to the walls of rooms and hug them as they flow around, slowly absorbing energy in the environment in order to build up their form and energy levels. As with Zoomers, these creatures were effectively harmless in this state, and can only hurt others by coming in direct contact with them, leaving them to occupy threat level alpha. Multiviolus were the adult form of the strange creature, and were noticeably different in that they had a series of much smaller copies rotating around their round body. These monsters were the true living essence of Mother Brain's power, and had no intelligence to speak of. The only thing that really made them a threat was that they could cause considerable damage from the hit and bounce along the floors and ceilings of any room they were forced into. Why they bounced instead of sticking to the surroundings is still unknown, but it is possible that may have just been their way of releasing excess energy obtained from the tiny copies that surrounded them. Regardless, multiviolus were not that threatening on their own, and could only be a serious problem when in large numbers, but they could still be fairly hard to hit and could take more punishment than one might think, making them an annoying surprise for those that underestimate their power and a clear choice for threat level beta.
The existence of these strange entities has perplexed me to no end, and no matter how deep I dig, I can never seem to come to an understanding of their purpose. What even are they? We have what we think is a definitive answer, but in truth, I don't think it is truly satisfactory to me. Without actual specimens to analyze, it is hard for me to say much on them or even get Cyancy to look into it all. But it is important that we keep what we can of them. If they are related to Mother Brain, there is much that Nina could one day reveal about the machinations of her mind, and the sheer power for telepathic attributes over others.
The polyp itself was not a real enemy, but the organic launchers that fired them at approaching targets were to some degree or another. Polyps themselves were small lumps of lava that had been infused with radioactive elements in order to make them poisonous and capable of taking down any creature that did not possess armor of some kind to repel the radioactive nature of the projectile. These balls were fired from organic pods that are bioengineered by the Zebesian space parts as living weapons, and had some degree of intelligence to them, as they were only fired at dangerous cargo when there's a target relatively close to them. Thankfully, these pods were completely stationary and were susceptible to the effects of freezing and concussive weaponry, so they were not a serious threat on their own. Plans for more of these creatures were scrapped after the hunters' initial venture into the planet Zebes, treated as a failed experiment in turret production that were quickly revamped into machines that are much easier to control and more reliable to point-blank interference, leading these entities to rot within threat level alpha. The Squeeps was an insect-like creature known for being able to handle the intense heat of areas like Norfair surprisingly well. These monsters possessed a spring-like body with a single pair of appendages, which used to propel the creature out of its favorite hiding spot of all, magma. The exoskeletons of these creatures were specifically designed to handle the intense heat of magma and could keep the creatures surprisingly cool internally, enabling them to effectively spend their entire lives within the devastating substance. Their large compound eyes also allowed them to see very clearly, though they had to live in fairly shallow magma pools in order to make the most of their vision. These monsters were not that harmful on their own, as their entire life aside from reproduction involved using the single pair of limbs as flippers to propel them out of magma pools with massive leaps, catching and eating any small insects that hovered above them with their large mandibles. As a result of their behavior, these creatures tended to be more of a hazard than an actual threat, but this was fine for those with freezing weapons, as they could usually be frozen in mid-flight and use as temporary platforms to cross large pits of magma. It did not seem to be harmed by this process at all, though concussive weapons like missiles were still able to actually take them down, limiting them to threat level alpha. The tango vine was a rare type of carnivorous plant that specialized in feeding on the weak and slow to survive and reproduce. Tango vines came in a variety of earth tones in terms of coloration, but they were all alike in that they had the appearance of thick vine-like projections from large masses that are usually attached to a substrate of a floor or ceiling. The tango vine let its vine-like appendages either hang from a surface or use electrochemical reactions to forcefully raise them into the air and wait for something to come into contact with them. When the tango vine ensnared something, it quickly wrapped around its prey until it had a firm grip and then extended a series of tiny sharp spines that stuck into the target. The prey was then injected with a corrosive enzyme that acted to break down their tissue and allow the tango vine to push itself into their body, where it then began to suck out the creature's blood and other vital fluids. The tango vine was able to process this liquid near its base in order to obtain nutrition, and while it might not have been able to do this process very quickly, its immobilized prey was usually not able to escape in that state. In the case of larger prey items like a secondary indigo larva, these vines could burrow into their bodies and then physically hoist them into the air by building up thick, sturdy vines that are strong enough to support the prey's weight. Moreover, they could even develop spore gestation structures in the larger prey items that could be used to fire corrosive spore pods as a defense against those that would wish them harm. Thankfully though, most tango vines are fairly thin and could easily be destroyed with standard beam weaponry, but thicker specimens could prove to be very difficult to harm and usually require the concussive power of a missile in order to break, though this isn't enough to actually elevate them beyond threat level alpha. Winged rippers were the rarest type of rippers and were only known to exist in the deepest pits of Zebes. Farther down the planet's crust, there was an abnormal part of Norfair where the electromagnetic signature of the surrounding rock walls was intense enough to disrupt the electromagnetic organ inside the classic Ripper. As a solution, these creatures instead chose to grow small organic white wings that could allow them to physically fly. While they were still limited in terms of intelligence and are usually limited to flying in simple patterns, this odd variant nonetheless had a cuter vibe to it than its relatives and was rare enough to make it a valuable specimen for research, especially since the species in its kind went extinct after the destruction of Zebes. Nonetheless, this did little to make them more of a threat, thus landing them in threat level alpha with others of their kind. And now, let's take a jump to the more recent past, the last time the hunter journeyed through this heated landscape. While the Foon and Namahi are often treated as completely different organisms as a result of their slightly differing anatomical forms, they are actually part of the same developmental line and are therefore worth describing together. These creatures are arthropods whose heads are the only features normally seen, as they embed the majority of their body space in a hard surface as soon as they are born. As these creatures grow, they slowly secrete an acidic enzyme from the back of the end of their body that helps to eat through solid rock and carve a space for the creature as they grow in size. Eventually they reach a point where the bodies will grow no more in terms of size. At this point, these entities can choose to go one or two different paths. Normally, they will stop excreting acid and instead replace it with a sticky glue that fuses the rock wall around them to their skin, forcing them to effectively eat and defecate through their mouths, but otherwise keeping them protected against extreme trauma, as their armored heads are very difficult to damage. On the other hand, it has been shown these beasts may occasionally choose to slither out of their holes and become completely maneuverable. This behavior was especially demonstrated on the bottle ship, and while it does give these creatures the element of mobility, it also leaves the red, softer patches of skin on the other side of their bodies open to direct attack and makes it possible to deal a lethal strike to them. Regardless of the path they take, Foon are the adolescent states of these creatures and are effectively locked into their current state for a span of several years. This can be a disadvantage for them as they have not developed any eyes yet, but they will actively still defend themselves by spitting orbs of blue hot fire that can scorch others from afar, even though they are unable to fire these projectiles very quickly. Despite their adolescent form, these monsters are normally impossible to hurt with anything other than a super missile, and thus could prove to be a noble obstacle to deal with, and worth fitting into threat level beta. Namahi are the fully grown adult versions of these creatures, and readily differentiated by possessing a darker body color, the presence of functioning eyes, and the ability to spit fireballs at a faster pace than their adolescent form. These monsters are much more resilient against damage, though they can still be killed readily with a lethal strike, so much so in fact that no form of conventional weaponry can actually hurt them. While these creatures might have been much more of an active threat than the Foon, they are nonetheless still capable of being frozen and use as platforms as with the Foon, making it possible to scoot by them and get out of their way before they thawed and continue their assault, though this is not enough to elevate them beyond threat level beta. The Magdalite was a magmatic organism that had come to use the searing heat of lava and magma as a tool of both intimidation and survival. The precise morphology of the Magdalite is still a relative mystery, as their bodies seemed to disintegrate the moment they were extracted from the molten pools they called home, but it can at least be said that they were in fact natural organisms with a supporting skeleton, green eyes, and a large mouth filled with razor-sharp teeth, perfect for chopping up charred meat and other organic materials. Magdalites seem to possess at least a limited degree of sentience to them, and were able to communicate in a true language, but it has yet to be deciphered, and the complexity of their overall social order is just as misunderstood. How the Magdalite was able to survive the scorching temperatures of the lava and magma pools they thrived in also has yet to be fully understood, but it is thought that its soft tissue was actually on the inside of their bodies solely, which means that the Magdalite did not have skin. Instead, the outside of the bones were coated with a heat-resistant metallic ore that kept the extreme heat of the lava and magma they lived in from burning their soft interiors. Magdalites did not normally have to feed on much to survive, as their bodies could internally process heat from the outside into energy, but if they were desperate for a few vital nutrients needed to support the skeleton and limited internal tissues, they would gladly attack anything that got near them for nutrients. In these cases, they would wait patiently in molten pools for a prey item to approach them, at which point they would lunge out of their pools and attack either by swiping at the targets with their coated arms or blasting them with massive globs of fiery and molten rocks from afar. Thankfully, while Magdalites were virtually indestructible in most cases, their superheated bodies made them extremely susceptible to the effects of cold, so a powerful blast of something like the ice beam could be used to freeze part if not their entire body, and then have them destabilize the impact of a missile or super missile to shatter their bones in an instant. Even with this weakness though, it is advised that caution be taken when near these creatures, as they came in many shapes and sizes and could easily become a serious threat if they decide to attack a prey item as a group instead of just individuals, earning a valid place within threat level beta.
I normally wouldn't say a whole lot here since I did many with machines and the like, but there's something about these creatures that just has never really sat right with me in the slightest. For a beast of any sort level with intelligence, to have a body that is basically just lava, magma, bones, and that's it? That sounds more like a damn machine to me than anything else. Even so, natural or whatever you may think, the resilience was still rather impressive. If it weren't biological, then whoever started off the production line and somehow still managed to make it possible for them to reproduce more of their kind should have gotten a raise. And if they were really natural, well, bugger me then, I don't have a clue what to say about it.
And of course, a brief mention here on past forces before we get to the main course. Red Zebesian space pirates were the main component of the Zebesian space pirate forces and came about as a result of these creatures fusing heat-resistant metallic ore from their homeworld into their exoskeleton-like hides, grinding them a brilliant red color. These creatures effectively possessed a pseudo-form of the Verisuit in their armor, and were thus able to withstand the extreme temperatures present in places like Norfair, and were even further able to take quite a bit more damage than normal, but they could still be destroyed with powerful beam weapons if they could heavily damage or otherwise penetrate their armor. Even so, their notable durability still places them a cut above the norm for their kind, and worthy of a place in threat level Gamma. And speaking of the main course, Crocomire certainly holds a special place in the memories of the hunter, not only for its bizarre appearance and vicious temperament, but for the brutal and gruesome way in which it died. The Crocomire was a massive reptilian creature that dwelled in the upper areas of Norfair prior to the destruction of Planet Zebes, and was perhaps the most fearsome predator in the area that it occupied, devouring just about anything whole it can get its claws on, as its intense stomach acids could dissolve even the hardest and most indigestible of food items. Unfortunately, it was also a bit too curious for its own good, and liked to explore the reaches of the planet as it hunted, sometimes ending up in areas that its body simply wasn't built to withstand. Crocomire was immune to the effects of the magma at temperatures seen in the upper areas of Norfair, but it was incapable of tolerating the heat of lower Norfair, and had on occasion bathed in pools of superheated lava there on accident, scarring its scaly flesh red and causing it to slightly melt to give it a disgusting look that reviled even the Zebesian space pirates that hassled it in such areas, though its pale white belly flesh still retained its natural color and texture. The creature possessed a small tail, 2 pairs of walking legs, and a single pair of arms, its 3-fingered hands and toes adorned with large claws that it could use to swipe at anything that got too close to it. Its head was largely exaggerated in size compared to the rest of its body, including its otherwise small tongue, and was crowned with no less than 8 massive blank eyes with just the slightest bit of color streaking around the outer edges of the ocular tissue. Unfortunately for Crocomire though, these eyes did it no good in its eventual confrontation with the hunter, as the monster had effectively been blinded from an accidental spill into lower Norfair, and it's likely that it once had very good vision with such large eyes in a bright environment like upper Norfair. Still, it was able to survive this horrendous incident and escape the area with its will to hunt maintained, attesting to the sheer resilience of its body and mind. In confronting the creature, Crocomire proved to be so resilient to damage that nothing the hunter threw at it was actually able to penetrate its hide. However, she did catch a lucky break in discovering the inside of its toothy maw was not as heavily armored and could be attacked, but not with direct results. Any impact that the beast received to its open mouth did not really hurt it, but it did force the beast to move backwards out of instinct to avoid another immediate attack. The hunter did not have the distance on her side though, as the opposite end of the corridor had a huge wall of spikes that could have easily impaled her if the beast decided to charge at her when she was close enough to them. With every single roll, the reptilian monster stepped closer and closer to the wall of spikes, but the hunter did her best to push the monster back further and further back. It demonstrated the ability to spew small fireballs from its mouth as a projectile attack, but this was more or less an actual favor to her since the globs of fire came fairly slow and easy to destroy. The hunter continued to fire away at the monster's open mouth, and as she forced it back, she noticed that there was an unsteady piece of bridge in the distance lying over the magma right beneath her feet. With all the firepower she had, she blasted the monster back until it was over the weakened piece of bridge she had spotted and watched as the structure crumbled under Crocomire's weight, sending it tumbling into the noxious liquid below. This, however, was not the normal magma that Crocomire was used to, but again the intensely hot magma from the deepest reaches of lower Norfair that had risen up through cracks in the cavern floor, the same substance that had damaged its skin and blinded it. With no way of seeing where it was or why it was in pain, the hunter could only look on as the monster's flesh and internal organs melted away, its eyes bursting and falling out as it screamed in utter agony, ultimately vanishing in a screaming puddle of goo. The hunter thought that the worst was already over, But as she stared on, she noticed air bubbles in the magma coming towards her and then slip underneath the bridge she had been battling on. She returned to the opposite end of the corridor where the spiked wall was, and the floor suddenly started to shake before she could even move away from it. Like a ravenous ghost, the skeletonized remains of Crocomire slammed right through the spiked wall, demolishing in the process, and motioned to attack the hunter one last time, only to fall apart into a pile of bones before the bounty hunter's feet, its body disarticulated with nothing left to keep it together. It is unknown if Crocomire would have been a more serious threat to the hunter if it had not attacked her out of literally blind predatory instinct and hunger, but it can't possibly be stated that the beast nonetheless suffered a fate worse than death before the very end, and would have been better off dying with the rest of Zebes' inhabitants in the eventual destruction of the planet. That said, it still showed noble resilience and could more than use its size to its advantage, and certainly belongs within the confines of threat level Gamma.
You know, the sheer idiocy of this creature is something that still gets to me, and I really don't know what to think about it. I don't even care if it was curious. It was clearly in a place where it didn't belong, yet instead of clambering back up to safer territory, it just had to keep moving and dump itself into a caustic environment that just totally ended up doing it in. What an idiot! What a maroon! You went all the way for seemingly no good reason, and look what happened. You got blasted in the mouth and dumped into a fiery cauldron of death. I mean, props to him for being so persistent that even his bloody remains had a sense of ferocity to them. Without anything to hold together, the massive bunker just fell to pieces at the hunter's feet. Nice try, Bozo. You need to do a lot more than that to scare me.
I think there's been said more than enough that Norfair was hot, and that thermal gear is almost necessary for any serious exploration of the area, and that largely holds true here at the end of the day. It was a place filled with magma and fire-spewing entities and monsters that had come to thrive in those extremely hot conditions, even if close relatives might have otherwise preferred to dwell elsewhere. What did help Norfair stand out, though, is that there were many beasts there that were found elsewhere on the planet, creating a vibrant and thriving ecosystem where even some plant life could find a way to handle the extreme heat. While this made it a much better place for biologists to thrive in their studies, it equally made it more dangerous for the varied biota and the many ways in which they could end an explorer's journey. As such, this land, though incredible to analyze, was simply far too dangerous for the average explorer, and best examined with great caution and plenty of chilled firepower. Well, that one was a bit too, well, hot for comfort, even with the archive data. But don't worry, we'll be getting out of the heat for a little bit for the next entry, though that doesn't mean it won't still be a bit dangerous. Brace yourselves for a video of spooky horrors and entities, for next we'll be taking a look at the remains of the wrecked ship. Thank you for reaching the end of this presentation. While we might not always get along, the Space Pirates and myself, in whatever capacity we can manage, are dedicated to analyzing and examining the life forms of many different worlds, extant and extinct, to show the great variety of life that exists out within the greater cosmos. If you enjoyed this info video and would like to see more, please like, comment, and subscribe for more information. We'll do our best to keep pumping out data so the greater public has an understanding of what to expect when exploring alien planets and their denizens. With that, have a safe journey, and have your bribes prepared beforehand if you happen to come near our territory.